Good afternoon, everyone. We are very, very pleased to come to this point with Merri work. So today we will have a defensive proposal, how usually it's going. We'll give opportunity to Merri to speak for like 30 up to 40 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and then after that we will have opportunity to ask questions. We'll give committee opportunity to ask questions, give their responses, and then if we still have time, we'll give opportunity for people who's here also to speak. Before we start, I would love to go very quickly around, even majority of us know each other still, to introduce, right, ourselves. Molly.
Merri Davis, a PhD candidate and proposal presenter.
Chrissy Jones, second-year PhD student and cohort with Merri.
Claudine Corona-Senge, PhD candidate.
Samantha Border Shoemaker, PhD candidate. Cherise Cardenas, S. Costa.
Alex Suter, I'm Merri's son and a 2017 George Mason undergrad.
And the fun.
Oh, this is pressure. This is real pressure.
Karina Karistelina, faculty at SCAR.
And Dan Rothbard, and I do not know myself, so I'm not sure what to say about that.
And
I'm Jennifer Ritterhouse. I'm a historian over on the Fairfax campus.
okay, thank you very much again. So, Merri, our eyes on you.
Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you to Jennifer and Dan and Karina. You've been supportive and helpful in so many ways, and I really appreciate the strength that you've brought to my proposal. It wouldn't be the same without the critique and the encouragement that you've given me. And thank you, too, for the people that are here to support me today. I appreciate that. My interest in trauma really was first coming from the idea of trauma being connected and the aftermath of violence. And that came from 5 years as an ordained minister in Danville, Virginia. It was there that I first learned about Danville's narrative as the last capital of the Confederacy. And it was as I came back to Northern Virginia to attend SCAR that I began to understand trauma as also a causation of violence. So the first slide here kind of summarizes what I hope my future dissertation research to be. You can see that it's oriented in Virginia, 2 locations in Virginia, Charlottesville and then Danville, which is almost to North Carolina, right on the border of North Carolina. And I've included slides or photographs of recent violent conflict that's happened in both of these locations. So the first photograph is from the violence in Charlottesville around the Robert E. Lee statue. And then the second photograph is a group of protesters in Danville protesting the removal of the Confederate national flag from a monument in Danville, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the idea for my dissertation actually came from a pilot study that I did in Danville, Virginia, and that had to do with this issue of the Confederate national flag being removed from the city museum in Danville, Virginia. It had been placed there in 1994, and there was actually a lot of dispute about whether or not that when the city museum had been the home to William Sutherland, and that actually is how the narrative about the last capital of the Confederacy was derived. But there was dispute about whether the Confederate flag was ever in place in the city museum at the time that it was a mansion. But regardless, in 1994 it was installed and began to fly over the city museum, which in turn had been a mansion where Jefferson Davis and his cabinet stayed in April of 1865 for just 7 days. And so after that occurred, then the city developed this narrative as the last capital of the Confederacy, just in that short time period. So the pilot study examined the beliefs around the Confederate flag in Danville, and I interviewed both white and African American people and found, interestingly, a real binary of beliefs around the flag. So this is sort of a summary of this pilot study. I've also included photographs of the civil rights movement in Danville. That was a very violent time in Danville. And over to the left, you can see a recent installation of a billboard once the Confederate flag came down from the City Museum in 2015, and that was following the violence in Charlotteston, South Carolina, that the city council actually voted to take the flag down. But once that happened, once this little 3x5 flag came down, then a whole group of heritage people decided to surround the city with enormous Confederate battle flags. So this pilot study was done after that process had already started of sort of the Confederacy, in a way, taking back control of Danville and supporting that narrative. Violence surrounding Confederate symbols really is nothing new in the United States, and it turns out in some research that I did to prepare the proposal, the first time that I could find evidence of violence over Confederate symbols actually goes back all the way back to 1863 with the first emancipation proclamation on the part of Abraham Lincoln. So at that point, 500 African Americans in Norfolk, Virginia, went through the city, tearing down Confederate flags, trampling them, and then marched to the cemetery in Norfolk and burned in effigy Jefferson Davis. So that happened all the way back in 1863. Since then, we've seen spirals of these sorts of conflicts around the Civil War, and I find it very interesting, actually, that not only has there been violence that has resulted in death, and we've seen that recently in Charlottesville with the murder of Heather Hay and 19 other people that were injured in that conflict, but in Danville there were death threats made to city councilors before the vote that were verified by the FBI, and all the way back in 1998 there was a white man that was killed in Tennessee for flying a Confederate flag in the back of his truck. In 2017, there have been 35 monuments either removed or damaged in some way following the violence in Charlottesville. And I might add, I think these polls on the part of Pew Research are very interesting, that even regardless of Americans' heritage, whether Southern or Northern, the majority of Americans believe that the Civil War is still relevant to American politics, which I think is very, very interesting. And 60%, including 30% of all African Americans under the age of 30, believe that the Civil War was actually about states' rights and did not happen because of slavery. Oh, and the pictures here, I'm not sure if you are familiar with these, but one obviously is the Robert E. Lee statue that's tarped after the violence in Charlottesville. The one to the right is again from Charlottesville. The one to the lower left is one of the Confederate flags going up in Danville. And this actually is the largest Confederate battle flag in the world that they put up within view of the city. And then the other photograph is from Durham, North Carolina, when the crowd attacked the Confederate soldier memorial there. It was pulled down, and then I think it's very interesting to see, you can actually feel in that photograph the violence and the hatred that people assign to that particular memorial. So the context for the research that I propose to do for my dissertation falls into three areas. There's been much historical research done, and this is where Jennifer was so very helpful in making sure that I got some of the really strong scholarship on the historical research regarding the opinions and beliefs around Confederate symbols within the United States. So Eric Foner, David Blight, which I had the pleasure to meet 2 weekends ago, and then William Blair all have done a lot of work around how the failure of Reconstruction still continues to influence in the United States today the way that people remember and develop narratives around the Confederacy. So although historical is one perspective, there's also been a lot of psychological work done on the idea not so much of the meaning of the Confederate memorials, but Dr. Volkin, a psychiatrist, has done a tremendous amount of work linking psychoanalytic understanding of memorials to large group memorializations and losses among people that have experienced violence. The middle area is the area that I'm really more interested in my dissertation, and that's the culture, political, and more so the moral impact of experiences of violence, and how that a particular type of trauma called moral injury trauma can develop as a result of changes to belief systems and actually in some ways incorporates all of these different contexts, this idea of moral injury trauma, which I will talk about more. But I think it's important to note that there, culturally and politically, there's been quite a large resurgence of white heritage movements. Some consider themselves white nationalists, but really a neo-Confederate movement that values the Confederate symbols as being very important in 2018. Another important factor in the decision to do the research in Virginia is the strong support in Virginia for segregation and Virginia's response to school desegregation through massive resistance and in some cases closing schools. In Danville, for instance, the schools were not fully integrated until the 1970s, and interestingly in Charlottesville, the first black graduate student was accepted in 1948, but it wasn't until the 1960s that there were undergraduate students of color accepted at University of Virginia. And certainly it's also very interesting to realize that in this dynamic, again related perhaps to the moral injury trauma, but there's been a real opposition by white Christian evangelicals to the idea of racial equality in Virginia. So this summarizes the problem statement for my research, and the sort of paragraphs on the right kind of show the logical progression in understanding what it is I'm hoping to research, that oftentimes large-scale social violence is followed by trauma, and that trauma can result in changes to value systems, which in turn affect deeply held beliefs and can result in moral injury trauma. And also that symbols are an important part of the way that communities show their trauma, that show their response to violence. And so even when they can't maybe explain the narrative, the symbols hold those kinds of beliefs and feelings. And then finally, that traumatized communities often lose resilience, and violence becomes institutionalized in structural forms, and then this in turn results in this sort of cycle that we see, which I believe that I've seen in the pilot study in Danville. Of course, I have not yet researched Charlottesville with enough thoroughness to say that this same cycle exists there. But certainly in both cities, the symbols are very important holders of narratives from trauma. So the research question that I'm hoping to focus on for my dissertation is, how is violence around historical interpretations of Confederate symbols and memorials affected by collective moral injury trauma? And the part of this that I feel is particularly pertinent for SCAR is the idea of exploring violence and trauma and a dual causality of trauma, looking at it not only as resulting from violence, but as causing violence. And I'm not sure that has been as fully explored as it could be. But in particular, I want to examine moral injury trauma, which actually, unlike other forms of trauma, is not a psychological designation. Importantly, I wanted to try to stay away from that for various reasons. I think that would be very difficult in a group setting to prove that people have been psychologically traumatized. I do feel, however, that a moral injury trauma, it becomes much more evident and much more easier to find the symptomology of within a community or a collective. So moral injury trauma, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but essentially occurs when either through perpetration of violence, people violate very deeply held beliefs, or on the other side, as survivors or victims of moral injury trauma, that the very deeply held moral beliefs that people have about how society should be protecting and elites should be acting is violated when they become the victims of violence. So my hope is, within my research, to expand current theories regarding the communal effects of moral injury trauma. Really, it's been focused on in individuals and looked at only in a couple different institutionalized settings. One is within the police force, but that's been a very, very small study that was done in Australia. And then within Vietnam veterans, again, not largely explored other than individuals. And I'm hopeful that I might be able to add to theories of resilience building and healing, taking the narratives from the people that actually participate and then searching those for foundational work in actually developing resilience. So the literature review that I did for the proposal covered many different types of literature, both social identity and the collective effects of traumatization within that theory, but also collective trauma within the moral injury symptomology. There's also a lot of work that's been done recently within the politics of public commemoration, so I've looked at that literature as well. And finally, in the way that public memory projects incorporate collective traumatization and also power narratives to some extent. So the findings from the literature review that I did really show that community traumatization has both a direct and structural effect, that social cohesion that can lead to resilience and can help sustain communities in the face of mass violence are affected by trauma in many cases, and that many traumatized communities are preoccupied with the past and show evidence of shame and guilt. So it was some literature about challenges to moral systems and ethics within traumatized communities. Again, this is one of the areas that I'm very interested in, and the way that moral claims, both through social identity theory and also within moral injury trauma, actually are used to validate violence and allow cycles of violence to continue. collectives experiencing moral injury trauma seem to share two symptoms in particular, shame and humiliation, and those become really important catalysts for violent behavior. So to go right to the gap in literature that I think that I'm filling, it's focusing on moral injury trauma in historic interpretations of symbols and memorials, and specifically I'm looking at the Confederate symbols and memorials, examining how narratives produced at repelling shame and guilt can be seen, especially surrounding meanings of symbols and memorials, looking at how moral injury trauma actually can affect collectives, and then how that can, if it is actually identified, can be used to reduce violence, and then can also be part of developing community resilience models. I have already covered this slightly, but the design that I'm proposing for the theoretical framework of my dissertation has to do with essentially three areas of scholarship: social identity theory, collective trauma, and then public memory scholarship. I don't want to take too long to go into these, and I will cover them a little bit later in looking at the way that I am proposing to analyze data. So the design methodology will be qualitative, and I think it's appropriate for this particular study because I am trying to look at the complexities and achieve a deep level of understanding within the conflicts around symbols and memorials, and the context of that. And also looking at the inductive method, I'm hoping to actually have the data produce a theory, or at least illuminate more of the processes that are involved in the context. The framework I mentioned earlier will be a comparative case study, and the two sites will be Danville and Charlottesville. So within the data collection and instrumentation, I'm going to focus on not just interviews. That will be the primary source of data, but I intend on doing a great deal of research actually on the history of these two cities, how the Civil War affected them, how segregation and views that come out of the Civil War continued to affect both of these cities, and including in the types of memorials and symbols that they actually installed in the community. But the primary data will be the semi-structured interviews. Certainly I'll do observations in both sites, and then also collect graphics and artifacts as they become available. I'm hoping to interview 30 to 50 people, and Karina, I did add in some consideration for how I would select the participants. So of course, I'll do all the standard things such as consent and confidentiality, but I also want to look very carefully at both the consequences and any contributions, beneficial contributions, to the people that I select for interviewing, making sure that they're all adults, at least age 18, that they don't have mental health problems, that they're not incarcerated, and then that they have cognitive functioning that won't in any way be harmed by answering questions that could be traumatic for them. The data analysis will have a multi-tiered approach. I will certainly look at the moral injury categorizations that Graham and Jinkerson offered, and Dan, I did look at, based on your recommendation, at a way of analyzing the interviews that would tie directly into the moral injury trauma. So Jinkerson did a really interesting study about the symptomology. He actually calls it a syndrome of moral injury trauma. So I'm including the core symptoms that he has identified as part of the way that the data will be analyzed, but also working from Graham's ideas about the moral dimensions of trauma within a moral injury and trauma context. In addition, I'll be using the work that you two did that I think is so very helpful in looking at how constructed forms, including mythic narratives, sacred icons, and normative orders, really help us see whether or not that the private understandings of hatred and other sorts of negative perspectives of the other, how those actually come into a public devaluation. So I'll be using that axology difference model and also doing the axological balance and degree of collective generality models. So this is the way that I hope to analyze the data. I plan on developing a written coding scheme before that I start doing any sort of analyzing, including a model that will help me take the codes that I develop and actually make that into theory or the basis for how that process would happen, along with parameters for the coding, synthesizing, all the things that go into actually analyzing the data. But I want to make sure I have a plan in place. I think that'll be helpful to making sure that I'm doing a thorough analysis of the data. So the validity, rigor, and reliability, I really like Maxwell's strategies. I'm not going to read all of these, but I think that it really involves self-reflection and a constant really looking for other explanations, so that you're never complacent with what you're finding and always trying to question and identify additional collaboration. But still, key to that is asking the question, is there another explanation? And then I'm very fortunate that it turns out that, that Joseph Montville has a project on healing the wounds of the Civil War that Carnegie Corporation is funding. And based on attending the first meeting of that group last weekend, the group has invited me to share my results over the next year. So in phases, I'll share the results, and it'll be really interesting to have those results critiqued by this other committee, although I'm sure get plenty of that from the three of you. These are other scholars that have an interest in the area, so I think it will be helpful. So I'm also attempting to make sure that I get the thicker descriptions, of course, triangulation, and then to really be reflexive in the way that I interact with participants in the semi-structured interviews. Ethics, I think, are just so paramount to this particular type of research. So I'm trying to be very careful to make sure that I consider the impact of the research on the participants. And this is something that means so much to me, coming from having spent 5 years in Danville. So that in particular it makes it so key for me to do this research in the way that illuminates what's happening both in Danville and Charlottesville, but without any way harming the people that are agreeing to participate. And of course, I will follow the code of ethics for doing all of the planning, the dissemination, all of the required human subject reviews. And if at any time I'm concerned, then I'll certainly share that concern in whatever kind of discussions that we need to have. And then as well as the participant concerns, I'm really sensitized to that as well. If I start to feel that the participants are concerned or in some way threatened by the discussions, then I definitely feel that I have the three of you to come back to for guidance in that way. There'll be a work plan that that I'll develop. I want to have this done before I start the actual research. So I see the research plan actually being done in 3 phases. The first phase would be over a 12-month period, and that, of course, will be following the Human Subject Review Board approval. I think it'll take me about that to conduct the interviews and then to be at a point where I'm ready to actually begin analysis of the data. Since there's the historic component of this, it's very important to me. I want to make sure that I have time to thoroughly do that for Charlottesville. I've already done that for Danville and some of the other work, the pilot study that I've done, but I think it's equally as important to do for Charlottesville. There's no outside funding necessary for the project. It's close proximity. I actually have a home that I can stay at in Danville, which makes that very easy, and Charlottesville is about an hour and a half from my place in Centerville. So I think that will make it easy to get started once I've got the proper approvals. So that's what I wanted to share in the way of the proposal, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. Dan or Jennifer, who wants to start? Jennifer, you are our honored member from other department. We'll give you the opportunity to speak first.
Well, yeah, let me gather my thoughts a little bit. But first, thank you, Merri. That was really helpful to have you lay it out that way, and looking at your PowerPoint as well. And it's just a nice flow to make the project make a lot of sense to me. I think my questions, not surprisingly, tend to relate largely to the historical components. I think that it was a new element to learn that the Danville flag was installed in 1994, and I was wondering if you have explored that at all. I mean, I think one question that underlies the entire project, and even I just jotted down the name, Healing Wounds of the Civil War for that working group. In many ways, these are, to me, not really wounds of the Civil War so much as wounds that are being played out through the symbols of the Civil War. And it seems like the historical components may have, multiple different spots on the timeline. And so again, 1994 is a spot that I didn't know we were going to be looking at, because I didn't know that point about the Danville flag, but actually the early 90s was a phase in culture wars in which flag was particularly heavily used. So I was wondering if that's a period you've looked at yet, or one that we should also talk about as we're trying to look at things like massive resistance or the installation of monuments, some of them in the 1920s, for example. So I guess first question is, what do you know about the 90s in Danville that leads to the explanation of this flag going up the way that it did?
I think that's a very interesting question, and it turns out that in Danville, of course, there was quite the almost delayed reaction to the need to desegregate, and they complied, but only because the federal government forced Danville into it. And so I think it was a question of Danville of really the federal government might have been able to legislate certain types of integration, but in other ways they could resist, and they continued to resist. If you think about the schools not really being fully integrated there until the 1970s, that's not much of a leap to 1994. And at that time, there was a real beginning resurgence by the Heritage Preservation Association, and at the same time, Danville was still fairly prosperous at that time, but within 6 years or so, the main employer, Dan River Mills, began to have tremendous financial problems. So I think that was really the beginning of threat narratives that were coming not just culturally to the whites in Danville, but also economically, and becoming very fearful. And at the same time, the race dynamics started to change. So the city was becoming more and more majority black, and the older white people were the ones that were staying in the city, but the demographics were such that the younger white families were moving out to the county. So there were a number of different sort of factors in Danville, but all around there, as I mentioned, there was, even in Tennessee, where the killing of Michael Westerman happened in 1998, that had to do with the resurgence of this whole idea of the Confederate reenactors, of sort of reliving the growth of the neo-Confederates. So it may not seem historically like it's connected to the Confederacy, but knowing at least Danville the way that I do, the way that the place where the flag got installed in 1994 was actually made available for the installation was that the Daughters of the Confederacy bought this mansion in 1912 from the original owners. It was about to be just totally razed, and the Daughters of the Confederacy came in and contributed money to allow it to become the city museum. And it was the same chapter of the Daughters of Confederacy that installed the memorial in the front of the lawn that in turn held the flag that came into such dispute. So there's a number of different linkages, but I think part of them at least are historical to the very special meaning given to this particular city museum that had been for 7 days the last capital of the Confederacy.
Yeah, I feel like one set of questions you're going to need to ask every interviewee is really about their knowledge of the local history over the long period. They're present, and I think that'll be a really interesting element of this, how much of their position on the questions has to do with, actual historical knowledge, and particularly in the local context, versus, again, use of symbols to represent kinds of things. And I was glad to hear you emphasizing the economic questions in Danville, because I think economics is certainly going to be a part of this as well. As you select interviewees, it seems like you're going to need to figure out how you're going to be able to go across that economic scale. And I guess another question I had was on the selection of interviewees. I mean, it sounds like it's something you're thinking about and continuing to flesh out, but to what extent are you going to be looking for people who are very close to controversies, people, for example, who were on the city council or who were making decisions, versus people in the community who, maybe are not in any kind of powerful role in relation to this, but might have opinions. So, who are you really looking for in your 30 to 50 interviewees?
Yes, that's a very good question, Jennifer. And I'm hoping to actually find people that were engaged in both cities, Danville and Charlottesville, actually engaged in the conflict. So the city councilors, because both the cities are approximately the same size, between 43 and 46,000 people. So the city councilors in both cities were very involved in the conflicts around the Confederate symbols. But at the same time, I don't think that it'll be too difficult. I actually know people in Danville, and I know people who know people in Charlottesville who were engaged in the violence. So in one way or another, I hope to interview people that for whom these incidences of violence weren't just something they read about in the paper, but they actually participated in some way.
And then sort of radiating outward, I suppose, from the actual incidents of violence to...
Yes, to taking some sort of active participation either in the city council meetings or in protest or in some way having an active role.
Yeah, and there I sort of noted on the idea that all your interviews need to be adults, which I certainly understand, but my understanding from the Charlottesville story is that the proposal to remove the statue originated with a middle school student who's probably not 18 even now.
Oh, you know, that could be. I have to say, I have not done a lot of research in Charlottesville up to this point. The reason I can talk so much about Danville is because it's been something I've researched for quite a few years now. But I think that it would really begin to complicate things if I had to give the human subject review for children.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not suggesting that you would want to interview her so much as just age is an interesting part of this, because of course we're seeing right now a moment when very young people are showing some activism.
Yes.
And I think the Charlottesville story is one that also illustrates this, because as I think I mentioned, UVA Press, through serving on their board, I've learned that there is in process right now a journalist who I believe is based in Richmond, but has done a lot of journalism in Charlottesville, who is working on a book that will be sort of the blow by blow of the Charlottesville events. And so it was in reading the proposal for that manuscript that I myself learned about this middle school student who sort of initiated the question to the city council about removing the statue. But I believe she was 8th or 9th grade, something like that. At the time.
Well, that's fascinating, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. Also, if you look on page 47 of my proposal, you'll see the interview questions that I've come up with. So that's something we can talk more about too once that this is over, if there's more clarification that you need about those.
Happy to turn over the floor if others would like to ask questions. I've got other things, but
Thank you, Jennifer.
Take the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Then?
Okay. Well, thank you. And before I start, I'm so happy to see other graduate students here, and I wish my students in my doctoral class were here. But, so it's very nice that you're here. Just kind of big picture.
You can shame them.
I will. I'm going to tell them tonight. And mention names of people as role models. You are the role models. So just big picture here. I mean, you are obviously ready to go full force on the dissertation. So the proposal is just really excellent, I think.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate also the additions of the historical information that you just summarized, because that really is so valuable. And then in relation to, as Professor Reederhouse just asked, what's their memory of which particular event?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, your knowledge is so deep, and theirs might not be, probably. So that would be relevant. But just kind of a preface, I really see your work, and you mentioned this, as highlighting 3 different sectors and advancing 3 different kinds of knowledge. The one, of course, is Volcan,
Mm-hmm.
who I tend to think is very inspiring and very thin.
Oh.
Lacking the depth that
Mm-hmm.
I think is necessary in his major books, at least. So you're advancing that, which is terrific. The second, as you mentioned, is the moral injury
Mm-hmm.
literature, which I find that concept really perfectly suited for your work for the reasons you mentioned, but it's very controversial among psychologists. And so, the kind of models that you mentioned are so important to show that the data, are matching these models. Symptomology was the word, or symptomization was the word.
Right,
Syndrome.
Jenkerson calls it a syndrome.
A syndrome, okay.
Yeah.
So giving real detail to what is the meaning of that
Yes.
syndrome. And then, of course, identity politics, which this fits in perfectly. So I'm just going to make suggestions that you really deepen the 3 areas that you mentioned. One is this model, to really give specificity and controversy. I mean, you could just say, this is a debate within the field, and you are selecting one viable or valuable model to use for your research. And that is part of the depth that you're showing in your argument, in the persuasiveness. The second concept, which I know you know a lot about, is, as you say, the beliefs that are being tapped into by this, the beliefs, the axiology. And one thing, just to be, I'm going to anticipate what you're going to hear. One thing to anticipate is that within the axiology, their value system, traditional categories are conflated. That is very familiar dualities that academic eggheads, don't quote me, academic eggheads take for granted are conflated. One of which is individual and collective. So people are going to, I mean, typically in these narratives, people will talk about